Are you all right, well, welcome. Yeah, a small enough crowd, we can just do maybe a round of introductions and we can keep this pretty informal. So I'll start. I'm Peter Frank. I'm a ecologist with Chugach National Forest. I live in Seward, based in Moose Pass.
Cody Jacobson. I'm the DNR Invasive Program Coordinator in the state. I'm housed up in Palmer and I live up in Palmer.
David Pearson, Zone Fisheries Biologist for the U.S. Forest Service, out of Moose Pass. Technically, I work for the Glacier Area Official.
You're up, Jen.
Oh, I'm up? Thought we were going around the room in there. All right. I'm Jen Chauvet. I'm the Invasive Species Program Coordinator for Homer Soil and Water Conservation District in Homer, but I am tuning in today from Oregon, from the Columbia River Valley area.
And I'm Dan Michaels. I live here in Cooper Landing. I've lived here since '90. Used to manage the Princess Lodge. And now I'm solely the softball commissioner. David Beats, live up Open Lake, and our house 25 years ago.
Well, yeah, we appreciate you coming and
we have one more online.
oh, okay.
Julia, do you want to introduce yourself? Not to put you on the spot, and no worries. Alrighty.
Yeah.
Peter, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just kick us off. So tonight we're here to talk about the Crescent Lake Elodea Eradication Project, which is being spearheaded by the Kenai Peninsula Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, which is a group that includes both multiple agencies. And I will pass it to Jen. She can explain a little bit more about what the CISMA is and its background.
Cool, yeah. So one of the hats that I wear in my role with Homer Soil and Water is that I coordinate the Kenai Peninsula Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, or KP-CISMA for short, which, as Peter said, is it's a partnership of a whole bunch of different agencies, nonprofits, tribal entities, a lot of community members that are just really interested in invasive species. And we work together across the Kenai Peninsula on invasive species projects. So we've been around since 2003, and we do invasive species surveys, monitoring, treatments, and of course outreach events like this as well. And it's a pretty cool group of people. I know you see a lot of logos here, but behind all those logos, there's a lot of really great, hardworking, dedicated individuals like Peter and Cody and myself, who just really want to protect Alaska's resources from invasive species. I think one of the cool things about the partnership is that we do kind of operate on our own in a lot of ways, but when something comes up like this, when a big project, when we find Elodea in Crescent Lake, we have this amazing pool of people to pull from, lots of different backgrounds and interests, and resources and expertise can come together to address the problem that we couldn't otherwise, of course, address on our own. Homer Soil and Water serves kind of like the backbone of the partnership. So we do a lot of the behind the scenes coordinating with the partners, and also seeking out funding on behalf of the partnership for projects like this. Yeah, that's basically who the CISMA is. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Elodea, but that is the plant, the topic of the night, the topic of the year for us KP-CISMA folks. So Elodea is a native plant. It's native in parts of the lower 48. It's native right here out my back door in the Columbia River. It's native in parts of southern British Columbia, but introduced to Alaska. We are concerned about it in Alaska because it has some pretty significant negative impacts, ecologically, economically, recreationally, pretty much anywhere it's been introduced. Ecologically speaking, though, we're particularly concerned about the impacts it has to native fish habitat. So, including salmon habitat, which is a really big deal on the Kenai, right? Where so much of life revolves around salmon and fish habitat. The plant it becomes pretty problematic because it grows super quickly. A tiny little fragment of it can very quickly create a massive infestation in a water body. You end up with these dense mats. I think Peter probably has some pictures of that later, that basically turns the entire water body into the least ideal place for most fish. Particularly our salmon. It's a common aquarium plant, and it's actually thought that that's how it was introduced in the wild in Alaska, that somebody, got tired of their goldfish or their aquarium and went and dumped that in a pond. And then from there it spread around, either just, water moving it around. It's easy to spread on, people spread it on our boats, our gear, float planes are a common way it gets spread around. I guess we can go to the next little slide there, Peter. So Elodea first showed up in Alaska in 1982 in Eyak Lake down in Cordova. Like I said, probably a dumped aquarium. And then we started finding it in Chena Slough up in Fairbanks, in the Anchorage and Matsu area, and then showed up on the Kenai Peninsula in 2012. I know on the slide it says October 2023, a total of 52 water bodies have been infested with Elodea. I don't know if Cody has another number there, an updated number at all. Are we just at 53 now?
I would say you could add a couple, because you have
Okay.
6 Mile. 6 Mile was found in 24 or 23. I don't know if it made that 52 list. And then it's also if you're a lumper or a splitter, because some lakes are several lakes in one. So
Yeah, gotcha.
wet water
Not to-
bodies.
Not to put you on the spot, Cody, but I did
Nope.
put you on the spot. So like I said, to zoom into where we are in the peninsula, we found it in 2012 first. And by 2019, it had been identified in 6 different lakes in the northwestern Kenai Peninsula. So the KP-CISMA came together and got all the resources and began treating those infestations in 2013. And after 9 years of treatment in 2022, all of the known infestations of Elodea on the peninsula had been eradicated. Great news, right? It's not the whole story though. And Peter can share the next piece.
Yeah, so hot off of a big year where we sort of officially announced that Elodea had been successfully eradicated. The Forest Service, which does periodic cycles of aquatic invasive plant surveys on a series of lakes across the forest. Crescent Lake came up on that schedule, and the technician you see in the photo, along with some other forest staff, found Elodea in Crescent Lake during a scheduled survey. So found in September 2023. We immediately went up following that initial survey and did a more intensive full lake survey. So where those surveys are conducted is we put fixed points along the perimeter of the lake in the areas that are shallow enough for Elodea to grow. We throw rakes and collect samples at each of those points. And then we also visually survey between each point. So there's also that surveyor shown here. So all the dots in red are areas where we found either rooted Elodea or fragments on the shore. So we came back in early 2024 and did a gridded survey, mapped every point, every location where we found Elodea, produced this density map here that shows more specifically where the dense populations of Elodea are. So in total, we found 5 infestations within the lake, primarily the largest of which, and probably the original, is this on this peninsula on the south western side of the lake. Then there's actually a tiny little fragment in a little bay up just adjacent or just across the lake from it. Then the population near towards the cabin. And then probably our most problematic is a large infestation just below the bridge there before that glacial creek comes in and is starting to dam that off. So that sparked us to go and or sparked concerns that it might be pushing down into Quartz Creek and down into the other areas of the Kenai River watershed. So we did a survey starting at the bridge at Crescent Creek and went approximately a mile and a half down. That was done by another partner, the Cook Inlet Aquaculture. So big thanks to them for doing that. You can see in there orange dots indicate Elodea fragments caught up in trees or branches or along the shore. Red dots indicate Elodea was rooted. So what we see here is that we found fragments of Elodea going all the way up to a mile and a half, or sorry, a mile and a quarter, down from the bridge. Rooted fragments much closer, all within a quarter mile, and all very small patches and eddies. So that creek's pretty high energy. There's not a whole lot of slow moving water for Elodea to grow in. So we're fortunate on that front, but it is definitely moving down Crescent Creek. We then surveyed Quartz Creek all the way from its intersection with Crescent down to where it dumps into Kenai Lake. This map fortunately didn't find anything. This map though indicates habitat suitability. So green being high habitat suitability. So there are there's quite a bit of suitable habitat in Quartz Creek. And so if fragments survive and move down that pretty long stretch of Crescent Lake, we think it's a high probability that they will be able to find a spot and establish in Quartz Creek. And there's some pictures of what that looks like. So on the left here, you see that infestation in the outlet So that's, I'm standing in that, taking the picture on that gravel bar from that glacial creek. And so this whole map is, Elodea. And interestingly enough, we have sort of bridge survey photos from our engineering shop. And, it's pretty evident that this infestation arrived in the outlet of the creek since 2019. The photos prior to that don't indicate that it's present. So a relatively new infestation, probably within the last 6 years, this is established. So definitely moving quickly and spreading quickly. And then this photo on the right here is sort of an example of the dense mats of Elodea that are growing on that larger initial infestation on the southern shore. So the infestation isn't sort of a total monoculture. It's not continuous, patchy, but in the areas where it is growing, it's very, very dense. So, with this information, we were able to sort of bring together a Crescent Lake Elodea working group through the Kenai Peninsula CISMA. Fortunate for us, we had, just gotten off of finishing up treatments on the Western Peninsula, so a lot of the mechanisms were in place. We're fortunate to have a lot of people in the partnership who have quite a bit of experience, primarily, Cody and the folks who are managing it in central and northern portions of Alaska, as well as a lot of folks on the Fish and Wildlife Service who've been dealing with it in the Western Peninsula for quite a while. So 4 partners is the Homer Sloan Water Conservation District, Department of Natural Resources, Cody, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, Cooklet, Inland Aquaculture, and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. There are quite a few other partners who are assisting as well. One of our first steps was ensuring that we had NEPA compliance to go after the species and do treatments. So we were able to secure that in 2020 through the adoption of a statewide programmatic EA through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then we were very fortunate to win a grant from the Alaska Sustainable Salmon Fund. They saw the urgency of this and the threat to salmon populations, and are providing the funding to hopefully go out and try and eradicate this. And for that, I'll pass it to Cody, who's our.
I'm gonna stand, I'm a little more active. As Peter mentioned, my name is Cody Jacobson. I work for DNR. DNR, I came over from Fish and Game from killing northern pike. So I'm very familiar with pike and working up and down the Kenai Peninsula. Not dissimilar to the Elodea situation, which I've worked on as well for many years. We had the same thing with pike. We're like, we've got them off the Kenai. And then we got the call a month later. And then we went back and got them again. So there is hope. The treatment part, this plant is a very interesting plant. As Ben mentioned, it's native to a lot of places in the lower 48. It does very well there. It's funny, I work with core partners that do a lot of the herbicide consultation almost on a weekly or daily basis, it feels like. And where they're located in the Pacific Northwest, they're actually trying to protect Elodea while they're treating Eurasian milfoil. So it's a very interesting dynamic in that sense. The treatment plan, as you can kind of see by the image there, which is think of a heat map for basically Dept. Elodea, I've come to believe there isn't 100% always and nevers. You can see it in lights. It prefers habitat of the soft, muddy bottoms. One of the drainages I work up in the Matsu Valley, Alexander Lake and Creek, you couldn't build better pike habitat, and you couldn't build better Elodea habitat. It's a shallow lake that basically has an average depth of about 4 to 5 feet. And It at one time was choked across the entire 700 acres. We've made a lot of headway on that water body. Luckily, with the dynamic of Crescent Lake, you know, you're not gonna see it growing out in the middle of the lake. It's gonna stay in the littoral zone, which is a fancy name for the shallow water areas that can reach the sunlight penetration, right? Where that changes a little bit is when you have water bodies that are very, very clear, which is, you know, Crescent Lake, as well as another one I work up in the valley, like Big Lake, if people are familiar with that system. So I've seen it growing pretty happily in Big Lake down to 20+ feet. Again, I think the structure of your, you know, your shoreline morphology and stuff in Crescent's a little bit different, rockier shore, not a soft muddy bottom as Big Lake has. But it's it's an invasive plant. It finds what it likes and it works with what it's given. Nice thing that as they mentioned, they found it, in my opinion, looking at the photos fairly early on. You have a very small surface area. Again, we're talking about 28 surface acres, which may feel large, but in the grand scheme of Elodea, that's actually pretty small, which is good. The treatments, the herbicides that we use, you know, you have to kind of, even when I started years ago with this, you have to kind of shift your mind a little bit because you're treating a plant in water versus treating a plant on land. So your contact time, which we see that a lot with terrestrial treatments, you know, you always don't want to treat when it's raining, you don't want to treat when it's windy, because you want good contact with the plant. Well, here it's always underwater, so you're always fighting contact. The products that we have, the DNR holds through DEC what's considered a general permit. And that basically, we've worked with DEC to very deeply vet a very small amount of products that we can then use for rapid response. This would be a rapid response situation. One of them, and sometimes, and I've got the literature if you folks want to look deep into it, but basically you have kind of active ingredient and you have product name. And that's what these, so the product names that we'll be using on this project is Latora, Sonar 1, and Sonar AS. And the Latora is active ingredient diquat or diquat dibromide. What that is, it's a contact herbicide that basically is a hyper concentrated salt in a sense. And what it does is it basically breaks the outer structure of the plant and it leaks out. It basically breaks those cell membranes and the plant dies back. Elodea is fairly susceptible to it, which is actually kind of nice. Some of our native plants, our native aquatic plants, will get a little burn, as they say, or a little knockback, but they seem to bounce back pretty quickly because, again, it's only a contact herbicide. Same on Elodea, it's taken out the biomass. So if you notice in one of those images where we have that big mass of plant in the, you know, the certain, typically the outlet area, that's a lot of plant that you're gonna have to treat with a lot more herbicide systemically to get all the way through it. You got to get all the way through the root system, all the way through that plant system. Whereas what we're gonna do is kind of a 1-2 punch. US Forest, or excuse me, Wildlife did this a lot down here in the Kenai Peninsula. John Morton, if folks remember John, it's worked really well throughout Alaska. Is that, and the other thing about diquat is it works really well if you hit the plant on a sunny day. It just lays it right down. But basically we'll kill back the tops. It will not affect the roots for better or worse, but it also won't affect the roots on native plants. Moving from there, and that's a one-time shot. You just want to do that once. It's not a very, well, relative terms, not an expensive product, but it's one of those where you want to use it on your first initial treatment. The systemic treatments, which gets down into the plant, down into the root system, those are ones that are much longer, and that's why this is kind of, you get in for a marathon. This isn't a sprint. With the fluoride, which is that active ingredient in there, there's basically different concentrations. Sonar 1 is about 5% active ingredient, and AS is about 41, 42. One is a pellet, which is Sonar 1, and one is a liquid. The reason you would use different products is back to that dwell time or contact time with the plant. The pellets are kind of interesting because the other 95% is literally kind of a proprietary secret of clay. What is literally happening is these clay pellets are going out and through, you know, water action, wave action, whatnot, the pellets are slightly dissolving. It allows that herbicide to come off slowly, so you get, kind of a bell curve of contact with the plant. With aquatic plants, the key to it is keeping it nice, long throughout the growth season. You want that plant to uptake it fully. So our AS is a little different because it's a higher concentration in the liquid. And that's because we're gonna be working around that outlet where there's a little bit more of moving, not so much moving water, but it's easier for it to get washed away. And so that's why you use two different products. If you had a still, no water exchange pond, I'd probably treat it with the pellets. Do it 3 times and walk away, and it'd be fine, because you literally go up, come back down, go up, come back down. Probably next one, Peter. This is kind of what the applications look like. Like any kind of applications, it's best to be, wear your proper equipment, whether you're cutting down a tree with a chainsaw or whether you're doing these type of applications. All the applicators that are going to directly handle the product will be basically kind of licensed under me, so to say. They'll be under my direction, is because I hold the permits. This is last year, different water body completely, obviously, but this is one of the young gentlemen that worked with me. Similar, there's what's called kind of it's a blower mechanism. The product, the pellets go into that large hopper, and then you basically use a weed or a leaf blower, and they basically get blown out in a pattern. So you get nice distribution. The other product, which I mentioned earlier, the Diquat or the Latora, that's in the kind of like the little 4-wheeler sprayer there. That's where it allows us to physically contact the plants. We'll see it, we'll be underwater application with it, and we'll basically, hit this zone of plant, hit that zone of plant. So it's you're not overusing the pump. The final slide, and there's a couple of the next ones, is what is actually happening to the plant. So that's a piece of Elodea there that is basically uptaking the floridone, and you kind of see the stem is starting to pink a little bit. And then if you look by hand, kind of blends it in better with that whole stalk on the left-hand side is basically fully clear. I don't think there's a couple more too, Peter. Yes. So what happens with floridone is it breaks down the photosynthesis process to where the plant, one, can't feed itself, so to say, because photosynthesis, we all learned that back in high school. That's how plants make energy, and they put that energy into their root systems, as well as it kind of basically sunburns itself. You'll see, and as they mentioned, so you've got nodes. So here's a piece of Elodea that is fighting, and it's shot out a new piece of growth, and that floridone has been fully uptake through the root system, through the contact of the plant. You can see on the middle picture there, all that, what we would call new growth, is all pink. So that's being uptake, that plant as it's growing. You kind of learn that too, when trees leaf out, they're pulling all their energy out to the very tips of their leaves and all that. It's pulling that floridone out to that growth node. And similar with that one on the other side, that one's actually further along in where you actually now see where the plant is degrading, like the leaflets themselves are starting to break apart. So that mode of action is kind of important to kind of understand of how that works, because that's why it's very important when this would be considered a spot treatment, because we're not going to treat all of Crescent Lake. Floridone is a very expensive product. A pail of floridone, I wish I would have invented it. 20-pound pail is $700. For some of the lakes I run, we're doing upwards of 700 to 800 pails a year. So kind of do those numbers quick in your head. You can see it's a very deeply invested product. But if done correctly, we see great results. That's why the Kenai Peninsula has such great results. Is, I think, and I give a lot of credit to Ms. Morton. I mean, they were on it immediately. When you treat early in the infestation, you use less product and you get a better uptake, because the plant itself is trying to work out and establish itself. It's trying to have rapid growth. As it rapidly grows, it takes up that product really well. And then the odds of success, as we kind of heard early on, we've got 52 water bodies. Treatments are underway in 40 of them. Treatments are ongoing in 20, or undertaken in 40 of them. They're ongoing in 21. Average right now is about 3.5 years. there's a couple factors to that. One, almost all Elodea treatments to be fully successful with fluoridone are gonna be a 3-year commitment anyway. So that 3.5 is probably one of a few things. One, when did you find it? Did you find it in the fall? Did you find it in the spring? So on and so forth. And then how do you mobilize that kind of funding? You know, how do you get access to, you know, $600,000-700,000 to treat a water body of a certain size? We've eradicated successfully on 19. The average year is about 2 years. That's on locations that are not extremely complex or extremely remote. Those are 2 things that add complexity to the treatments. How do we get into them to treat them? And how do we monitor them closely? That's kind of the tough thing. A lot of folks were familiar with invasive, have seen this before. The invasive curve of how it works, you know, prevention is the cheapest thing. That's why outreach is important. You know, having folks like you come to presentations like this and know what Elodea looks like. When you're out recreating, you're out hiking, you're out bear, you know, hunting or whatnot on a water body, like, what is that plant? That looks like a lot of growth in the water right there that doesn't seem natural. Take a picture, snap it to me, send it to someone. I'd love to look at it. I'd much rather look at 400 pictures of a native aquatic plant and miss one of Elodea than not. Because early basically response or rapid responses, it's called, leads to much higher success of eradication. When you let water bodies move into that kind of containment, or almost basically, are we gonna live with it at this point? You know, we've got a few species in the state that are probably getting to there in some ways. You know, some I've worked on. I'd like to have, you know, more success stories, but the key thing is, nice thing about it is Crescent is much more right here. You know, we are in that early detection, rapid response. You know, was found basically a year ago, 1.5 years ago, and now we're responding, which is great. I don't think there's, and it's small, you know, that's the thing that's a big important part of it, is that you don't wanna, you know, we don't wanna be treating all of Crescent Lake. We don't wanna be treating the 1,300 acres that it is. So. Of course, the consequences of no action, I believe maybe all 3 of these photos are from Alexander Lake that I mentioned. So you can see a sockeye there. He might be similar to Lonesome Larry or whatever. I think he's one of the few ones I saw out there, but that is literally a blanket of Elodea that's probably about, you know, as deep as my waist. That sockeye just kind of slowly looking over there. So obviously it has no access to gravel bed, redding, anything like that. The spread just goes exponentially higher if we take no action. Obviously Crescent Lake is a recreated lake. It's a floatplain lake. You know, lots of factors there for movement, which we want to avoid, we want to treat. The other thing nice about it too, that I didn't mention, when you start to go into treatment and you start seeing those plants that are uptaking that fluoridone, you know, those are the outer growth nodes. Those are also the parts that are most likely to get picked up in a propeller, a rudder, you know, boating equipment, what have you. They're by far, I wouldn't say no chance at all viable, but by far much less viable to then reestablish if they're dropped somewhere else in another water body, because they've got that damage already occurred to them. Mentioned already a little bit, but it is, you know, very detrimental to hazardous waters. It slows water flow. It can, you know, we have at this kind of infestation point, when you get dieback, like any kind of aquatic plant, there is some senescing in the fall. You get that large dieback, you're going to really drop your dissolved oxygens throughout that water body, especially if it's a warm, shallow, muddy water body. You're really losing DO. And it is a very real increased safety hazard. I have literally seen a de Havilland beaver stuck within this stuff. Granted, we weren't trying to take off, but we were trying to get back out of there. And we literally all had to get out, and he had plain water. I mean, we were basically to the point where we're in, you know, chest waders trying to move him, but it's just that the rudders could not function within the amount of Elodea that was there. And it greatly reduces the recreational value. You know, we've got some cabin guys up, on some of these water bodies that are now literally thinking of selling their land, because it's, you know, the recreational value. They don't want to move it. They want to be good stewards of the land. So they basically don't come in and recreate in the summer anymore. They're wintertime recreators, so. That's another factor to think about too for the no action. There certainly is our fishery concern. Some projections from some of our colleagues have looked at it. If it gets out to Bristol Bay, which is of course a huge concern of ours. These floatplanes can move from Anchorage to Matsu, from the Kenai Peninsula to Bristol Bay, and they do. I mean, they were gonna be starting here in the coming weeks, flying over to Leon, King Salmon and that kind of places. They will love to be within these shallow, warm lakes. The industry would be very hurt by it. Right now, Alexander, we're approaching about 2.2 million invested into that water body. The costs are gonna get exponentially higher the longer you wait. It's gonna be that much more to keep the concentration up within those water bodies to, you just have to do it longer and everything goes up with more. And it's not like the Florida is gonna get any cheaper. So. I think that's.
So is there any way of keeping the floatplains off the lake or reducing or?
So one of the things we did out on Alexander. Cause that literally is, so anyone that's familiar with the south set or kind of that Matsu Valley, western, actually it's more just directly west of Anchorage. It literally is a touch and go floatplane lake, for test pilots. So I work with, the Pilots Association, Seaplanes Association to say, hey, these are water bodies I'd really love for you guys to avoid. The other thing that we were able to do, I don't know, is kind of a one-shot deal, so to say, but we worked with our partners over at Fish and Game. And we put in basically a closure of fishery. So there was no fishing allowed in the summer season, with the idea that we greatly reduce the want to be out there. Why would someone pay to fly out there or even recreate themselves to go out there that costs if they're not allowed to fish? That's a strong one to advocate now because the lake is so fully, it's got pike throughout it, which is also a non-native. It's running into this, we're invasives fighting invasive, so to say, management wise. And so we want to remove as many pike as we want. So we want people to go fish, but we also don't want them to move the Elodea. To my knowledge, at least I know I do not have the power to say you cannot float plane. When it got into Lake Hood, there was some talk about that as far as a recreational hazard or a safety hazard, and it could be, if it's allowed to grow. That's why now Lake Hood saw full treatment, immediate treatment. And that's been a few years now, probably at least 5 or 7. Lake Hood typically now there's, which is interesting because it's part of the airport, so part of DOT. It is surveyed every single year, usually twice a year. And they actually now are in some ways peripherally treating with diquat just to keep all weeds down. Just kind of trying to check the boxes of like, hey, if there's another weed that shows up from somewhere else, or if Elodea somehow gets reestablished back in, because there's daily flights leaving Lake Hood to go throughout the state. There's daily flights that leave Big Lake, Alexander to go into Lake Hood and so on. So, yeah.
The guy who's passed with the floatplane. Is he?
It's up there a lot. So we developed this flyer for particularly targeting floatplane users and sent it to him. We definitely are striving to get the word out to floatplane pilots. We had worked with Civil Air Patrol to try and get the word out, but if you guys have contacts in the aviation world, we're actively seeking to get the word out.
Yeah, no, for sure. Anyone and it's interesting because they're a very tight-knit group. Sometimes, because that's their first concern, is I come in, the state guy, and I'm gonna stop them from going places. So sometimes they don't even want to chat with me, but I go, hey, we're just another guy. But there is actually some ongoing work right now. It's funded through a little bit different, through UAF to do basically a floatplane pilot analysis, survey, kind of where are you going, how many lakes are you touching and going to? Kind of a patterning thing, pretty good participation. They have a very small, I think it's $5 or $10 incentive type thing that they can afford to do, but basically to get engagement. To kind of get at that exact question, you know, where are these floatplane pilots moving in and throughout these infested water bodies? And, excuse me, and how often is that happening? And where are they going? You know, because it's kind of the next thing is, what we're gonna struggle with is if this monster, so to say, gets outside. And we start seeing it in odd places like, and these places are being surveyed, but like the Bethel floatplane pond, or, you know, up by the Brooks Range, the Brooks Range aviation flies up there. And, you know, for some unknown reason, somebody left Fairbanks out of Chena Slough, you know, and it's jumped up there. So that's where the faster we can get onto these projects, and especially with the heavy floatplane traffic, it's that much better.
Well, I think, that's the presentation. We'd love to open it up to questions, dialogue, thoughts. Yeah,
You're gonna treat it this year.
Yep.
And probably come back the next 2 years, yeah.
correct. Yeah, so right now, we're gonna start treatment the week of July 7th this year. And that's based on some research we've done on the turnover in the lake. So Dave has helped us installing temperature probes up there the last 2 winters, and we use that data to identify periods of relative stability within the lake. So those are the winter where it's stable throughout the water column, and then in the summer, once the thermocline sets up, and then you have the top 30 feet of water is relatively stable and mixes within itself. So that's why we're starting in July and not earlier, is because we don't want, in June, there's a full lake mixing event. And so if we put this product in June, it's gonna mix into something like 900 billion gallons of water that's in Crescent Lake, and we're gonna lose our concentration.
Yeah, contact concentration is very important. It's especially when you're doing partial lake, because you have to kind of think of, when you put this product in, it wants fluoridone especially, which is a good thing in a sense. It wants to move. It wants to move throughout the plants. And if it's a full lake treatment, no big deal. But when you're treating sections of a lake, that could be a very bad deal. So you want to really think about when you're going to treat, what kind of water exchange you're going to see, and you have to kind of basically, you know, if you just have the plant right here, you have to kind of treat around it to allow that uptake, that concentration. That's also why you kind of hedge your bets by doing multiple treatments throughout the summer. You know, it's where you hopefully can take the bumps out of the curve, so to say, where if you get a rain event, it's not a big deal or something like that. The other thing too is you want the plant to be growing. You want the plant to be uptaking. And so you want to make sure that you're really very conscientious of how you're spending these funds.
So like on that patch at the mouth.
Yeah.
That's gotta be an interesting one, just because you've got a lot of flowing,
Yeah,
and so it's not gonna be able to just sit
so
in there.
That's why and I guess I should have highlighted that. That's where we're gonna use what's called basically a drip station. They call them SAT units. But this one's gonna be a little bit pared down because of the remoteness. I've got 3 or 4 of them that I've run between Fairbanks and the Mat-Su. They're basically a reservoir with the liquid. And then for lack of it's a hydraulic or a peristaltic pump that fires on a sequence. So it's literally like cha-chunk every 5 seconds, every minute, depending on how much product you want to put out. And that's why that liquid is nice, because it's a little higher concentration, so you don't have to volumetrically bring so much. And it basically will then enter that water and it will kind of mix throughout that zone, but you're keeping it constant. You know, that's kind of the key. I didn't get too deep into the weeds, but on the concentrations of those, when those pellets actually work, because we can take water samples and get actually pretty quick results on where we're at, where we're sitting. The sweet spot on Elodea we found, at least for Alaska, is about 8 to 12 parts per billion for around 45 to 60 days. And to put that in perspective, like parts per billion, of course, folks probably understand that, but you're literally talking like less than a kernel in a grain silo. I mean, it's a tiny amount of liquid in there. The other thing that's nice about Floridone is there is no restrictions. So, I mean, once it's into the system, you can swim, you can fish, you can eat the fish, you can drink the water. But advocate that, personal opinion, but there's water in Anchorage I wouldn't drink. Definitely not Chester Creek. So, there's certainly things that, and they're caution labeled, they're caution mainly from the standpoint with the Latora. It is, like I said, it's a high concentrate salt. So it's more so from the applicator standpoint, when it's full concentration, if you get it on your skin, you're gonna get a little sunburn, so to say.
So I would think like if, again, at the mouth of the lake there, that's also one of the best fishing spots. So I would think you want people staying out of the Elodea or, just because that stuff breaks apart.
It does.
It does. Yeah, it does not take much. And also when the plant starts to stress, so i.e. rapid growth or i.e. we're treating it, it's gonna break even easier. I mean, I don't know, again, there'd be something, DNR cannot control fishing game can control fishing. It's kind of through knowledge and expertise. The nice thing about it is we'll be treating that stuff. So the thing about it is it's kind of, I think people will be there no matter what. And at least we're, making folks aware of it. There'll be signage. There is, I think it is going or has, there's a big float plane sign. There's a few of them that basically, they're big enough. I hope. I tested it on literally a float plane pilot. I think it was from Texas. I was like, hey, can you read that? And he's like, yeah, what's this? So, they can see it literally when they land.
Yeah. So we've got it signed at or we'll have it signed at the trailhead. And then we'll have signs up at the bridge indicating what's going on. And then at both cabins, what Cody's talking about, we've got, it's a 3x3 metal sign that says attention, there's Elodea in the lake, and it's big enough print that, the pilot taxiing in can read it, and then it's got some instructions on how to check your rudders and raise and lower your rudders so you don't move into other lakes, so. But yeah, thus far, fishing definitely up there would be, cautious of.
Maybe foresters to say, like, why did you not grab it? And then you're not changing fishing regulations, you're just saying.
Sure.
That helps out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is that it's pretty interesting once it gets into that, cause that was a major concern within the Chena, stuff like that, it's a grayling and stuff up there. It really changes the dynamic, you think you know flow and everything but when you put that much biomass into that system, even though it is a very soft body, it really slows it down. And they were pretty quickly concerned with, and that's why there's been a lot of vetted study, for better or worse, we're much more quickly achieving, work on these projects because we've had so much background on them. Grayling was a major thing that Fish and Game and the folks up in Fairbanks concentrated on. I was like, one, how do these products affect the grayling? How does the Elodea affect the grayling? So on and so forth. How are the grayling and the other native fish species interacting during treatments? So on and so forth. So luckily it seems like, it's pretty low impact, and that it's a real driving force to restore that habitat. And that's a huge part of it. And like I say, if you can hit the concentrations, it works really, really well. Floridone, I mean, we saw that down here, I think it was Sport Lake near Soldotna there, was treated very effectively. I worked out in the Vogel system up on the refuge on the tip up there. Basically, we went in, we found pike, then we found Elodea, so hand in hand. But the sandpiper work, I mean, they were able to achieve that in 2 years. Because small infestation, found very quickly. They did the 1-2 punch and worked out very well. And they sort of, US Fish and Wildlife has looked at that system, I believe, every single year since. So,
Yeah. This will be a multi-year project for sure, definitely, and that's, we're on the thank you slide, so we can restate that we're, we were fortunate in getting a grant that covers multiple years, so that was really important to us, that we didn't just piecemeal funding together every year, that we got a full 3-year worth of funding to treat this, so increase our chances of success.
Well, it's our chance to say thank you.
Yeah.
For jumping on it.
yeah, that grant is huge. That is, that was a breath of fresh air when I was notified from Jen on that one.
And what's the name of where you get the grant?
It's the Alaska Sustainable Salmon Fund.
Yeah. It comes through, it's federal dollars, it comes through Fish and Game. It starts out as oh gosh, all the acronyms. Technically, I believe it's all the way from NOAA. NOAA then gives it to the Pacific Salmon Recovery Act. Don't quote me on that, please. And then the Pacific states that deal with Pacific salmon are doled out to the representative, basically entities for state of Alaska's Fish and Game. And so then Fish and Game has a very competitive grant process that goes out, mainly focused on habitat type things, but you have everything from fish passage to invasive eradications to anadromous water catalog submittals, stuff like that, that typically fall under the Alaska Sustainable Salmon Fund. It has funded a lot of Elodea work, thankfully.
And it's not susceptible to being cut in this.
It is not. I mean, we were from the from the grantee side of things, we were a bit nervous as other of our funding sources had been frozen. But no, it's moving forward. In fact, we were able to receive an advance payment to go ahead and purchase some of the herbicide for the first year of treatment. So it's moving forward, which is great news.
Are you guys flying up all this stuff then?
Correct, yeah. So, another shout out to partners, Fish and Wildlife Service is gonna run all the aviation with their fleet, aircraft. And so we're working out the final details, but I think we're gonna be, basing out of Trail Lake. As Trail Lake is, very much not suitable habitat for Elodea because it's so turbid. So, very low risk of transmission that way. So we'll station out of Trail Lake and shuttle all this herbicide up there, and it's, so. And
Yeah, that's key. You don't want to be the guy that brings it back and forth. That's what keeps me up. That's what keeps me up.
Because if it was Trail Lake, it would already be in there. He's
back and forth all the time, yeah.
Yeah, you tend to see them, I think it's, I don't know, it's interesting having dealt with invasives now for, I don't know how long, but that basically, especially on some of these things, you see them in spurts. And I don't know if it's just in cycling of when we're looking, right? But I think especially on plants and Elodea in particular, because it does establish so quickly, it hasn't, I personally feel it hasn't been there a decade. You can just look at it, the way it's grown and whatnot. Other systems, you'll see it where real brand new, fresh growth. It's very, again, it's happy. If it's happy, it's very lush, very green, very thick. Where it's struggling, but has been there for a while, you start to see it really kind of fight. You know, because it can move, of course, vegetatively. Through fragmentation, stuff like that, but that root system, of course, is trying to push through that mud system. Other parts are trying to reach out, similar to, you know, they'll either re-root back down, break from fragmentation. So. One of the big things that was kind of a shocker on some of the systems I worked on is it being transported by ice out. That was one that was a bit of a downer, because it does actually, we've shown it to go to sleep in the winter. In some places where there's very thin ice caps, it'll continue to grow. And then the ice will then lock down to it, and then it'll go out. There's actually an image somewhere, I don't think it's in my brochures here, but there's a good image one of my coworkers has where it's a chunk of clear ice and the Elodea is green as can be within it. And we see that where basically some of these large rafts get sucked out and, you know, ice outflows when the lakes break up and they move down these creeks. So that's why we want to jump on that outlet. That's where you want to be very quick to take after some of that.
That's terrible.
Well, don't get into basics unless you got a tough heart, man. They're tough. But yeah, no, it's I'm very excited about this project. I think it's one where a lot of things have come together very quickly through a lot of struggles, as you mentioned, you know, some of the financial stuff, and so it's great to see how dedicated folks are to making this happen, because it takes some push. You always gotta keep pushing.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Bet. Appreciate you coming out.
Yes.
I do.
Already had such competition. People are.
This one's kind of nice because it gets kind of the same Elodea stuff, but on the back, it shows you some natives.
Oh, okay.
And so like folks, you know, if they, you know,
Canoe stuff, so.
perfect. Yeah, another one I'm really hoping I never get the call from is like the Swanson River Canoe Trail.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that might just retire me.
Yeah.
You bet.
Have a nice night.
Well, I guess, Jen, did we have any questions in the chat? I kind of forgotten to ask.
No, we did not. I would have piped up if we had.
Okay. Well, I think we're wrapping up here, and so yeah, I think I'll stop sharing, and yeah. Julie, we appreciate you coming, and we'll I guess we'll sign off.
Thanks, Julia.